Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Janet Kiefer. I did recently join the Simdfw Programs Committee. And tonight I'm excited to introduce you to Jim Smelley, who will be speaking on the topic of blackout and insider perspective on the Texas electric system failure. Call him James Smelley, call him Jim Smelley. I think he'll respond to both. A little bit of background about Jim. Jim and I worked together in IT consulting quite a few years ago. It was at that time a number of people, including Jim and our company, were focused on the energy sector and helping Texas energy commissions make the transition to deregulation. So as the Arctic blast hit Texas in February, I knew Jim would have a perspective or two on the energy crisis that ensued. So tonight, Jim will highlight the intersection of systems analysis with the Texas energy crisis. Here's a little background about Jim. Jim has a degree in computer science from Trinity University in San Antonio. He has consulted for ERCOT, the Public Utility Commission of Texas, TXU, Oncor, Direct Energy, Reliant, Just Energy, North America Power, AEP, Commerce Energy, Ambit, Liberty Power, and Griddy, as well as several generators, gas companies, and software companies in the energy sector. Today, he is an author and board member at Cyber Group in Dallas. Jim, I welcome you to DFW Sim and look forward to your perspective. Take it away.
Jan, yeah, thank you so much. What a great, wonderful introduction. I have a question before we begin, though. I need to know if you guys can see my board and actually see it. Can you all visually?
Yes, if you stretch your arms all the way out, that's about how much we can see.
Perfect. So thank you so much. And Janya, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at SIM today. I've been to many SIM meetings in Dallas back when I lived there. Today I live in Dallas, and I admit it's sort of, I live in Denver, and I admit it's sort of strange for me actually to be here doing this presentation to you guys in that way, but I'm really honored to be doing it, and thank you so very much. Janya already gave my energy bona fides, but because I live in Denver, I feel like I may ought to give you my Texas bona fides to start with before I begin. So if you'll allow me, I am from the bottom part of the state of Texas, down here in a little tiny town called Pleasanton. Pleasanton, Texas is a town of about, when I lived there, a town of about 5,000 people. It has grown substantially now to be almost 7,000 people. Huge town. I was extraordinarily brave. I moved from Pleasanton, Texas to San Antonio, Texas to go to college, almost 60 miles away, and where I, as Janya said, studied computer science. And then I moved to Dallas after I graduated to start my career. It was in Dallas that I began working for the energy industry. As Janya said, we were in a consulting company whose primary clients at the time were in the energy industry, and I sort of fell into that job. I loved it, by the way. I spent, in fact, my first year at Texas Utilities, I spent basically a year in front of a whiteboard like this, drawing diagrams, trying to figure out how this industry would break up. That was in 1999. But things had happened before I arrived. In 1995, Texas started to deregulate its energy. Back then, most of the energy generation in Texas was either coal power plants or nuclear plants. And what Texas did in 1995 is it allowed those nuclear and power plants to be separate, operate independently. They didn't have to belong to the transmission and distribution networks. But in 1999, when I started coming along, they started to do something far more important with Texas. In 1999, they split up the generation and transmission units in the state of Texas. This was a very big deal. These previously grouped utilities had generation and transmission, And splitting them up, Texas was hoping that it would provide a platform for creativity, for more productivity, and for new kinds of generation. And I think most of you are in Texas, you know that that worked. We're going to talk about it in a little bit, but you know that Texas has become a powerhouse of both electricity and other kinds of power generation. Let's talk a little bit more about what the grid looks like in the state of Texas. I've talked a little bit about the generation, the transmission lines, and the distribution lines. The transmission lines are the ones you see normally running across an interstate, the like giant ones, and the distribution lines are the ones that connect up to the homes and businesses around the state of Texas. And Texas has a lot of demand. Part of the reason that Texas did this deregulation starting in 1995 was because it knew that its population was growing. In 1999, the population of Texas was about 20 million. 20 years later, it's almost 30 million, right? I think it's at 29 million later. That puts a huge amount of additional demand onto the system. And Texas, sorry, somebody just said this reminds me of UPS commercial. I'm going to take that as a compliment, whoever said it. So I appreciate that.
Total compliment. You're good at it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see. So decoupling these utilities and splitting these up was a major success for Texas. It has added a lot of capability to Texas market. In order to make this work, though, Texas had to do two other things. The first was it had to create something to create a commercial market. And in Texas, we called these an REP or a rep. What the rep does in Texas, and any of you who live in a deregulated part of Texas will know this, what the rep does in Texas is it creates a commercial relationship between people on the business side and the generation. So it basically creates the monetary relationship. These companies have become nationwide names now, right? Nobody knew of Gritty before February, but they've now become nationwide names that people know. So in 1999, when these reps were created, there was one other thing that had to happen, because previously when you had an integrated utility, they managed their reserves, they managed their demand, they managed their supply. That wasn't going to work in a deregulated world. So they took an existing entity, which again, was not a commonly known name until recently, called ERCOT. Even in Texas, this was a relatively obscure organization until just this year. But in order to make Texas work, the legislature gave ERCOT some additional powers. And these powers, these responsibilities and powers are very important to understanding what's about to happen in Texas when Snowmageddon, I think somebody earlier called it, hit. So these three responsibilities are maintaining the balance in the network, maintaining the reliability of the network, and establishing a power market. Let's talk about each of those a little bit. Balance is the most difficult challenge of the giant mechanical system that a grid is. A grid is just a giant system like any other system. It has inputs and outputs, it has a purpose. And the difficult challenge of an electrical grid is that this system can maintain no reserves. The demand that is being demanded at a time and the supply have to match all the time. Now this, I know there are batteries now and there are real legitimate utility scale batteries, but these are not in effect in most places in Texas. So there's really no legitimate storage capability yet. In Texas, maintaining the balance on the grid is actually a bit of a challenge. And again, you may have heard some of these things. First of all, Texas is a small grid. It's isolated from the rest of the United States on its own. It's an island grid. That decision is not a new decision. This decision was made approximately 100 years ago. This isn't a new decision made by radical politicians or anything. It's an old decision. But that decision does come with complexity. It makes it much more difficult to manage this grid. If you look at the Eastern and Western Connect grids in the United States, they cover all of the rest of the United States and Canada, right? So the size of those grids is much more significant, and that makes it much easier to maintain. The other difficulty in Texas is the weather. Texas is divided into many zones. So you have a dry zone over here, we have a wet zone over here, a relatively cold zone in the top, and a relatively warm zone in the bottom. And if you look at like the I-35 corridor that goes down, that is actually sort of the dividing line that people make in sort of the weather zones whenever they're predicting weather for energy purposes in the state of Texas. One other thing makes Texas's grid hard to maintain and balance, and that is actually a success story. The success story is the amount of wind energy that Texas generates. On a good day, this is not every day, but on a good day, a third of Texas's power can come from wind. That's an amazing success story. It's basically free power. It doesn't cost any petroleum to make, and it makes no carbon emissions. Wonderful story. But wind is not a reliable source of consistent energy. When the wind dies down, wind power dies down. So this responsibility of ERCOT to maintain balance is difficult and extremely important. And you're going to see it playing in on the night of the storm when ERCOT loses the balance in the market. The next thing is maintaining the reliability of the grid. And this comes into when something happens, and things happen all the time, generators go out, power goes down, there has to be a reliability plan. And so ERCOT requires all of these companies, all of these transmission and distribution companies that are still largely regulated, requires them to have load shedding plans. And I bet everybody now has also heard of a load shed, because what happens when there's not enough power, some circuits have to get removed from power. These are not ad hoc decisions. Some of the news reporting on this has been very misleading, I think, in the way that it's been covered. These companies have these plans, they are established and they are written down. They do not make ad hoc decisions on how they are going to manage them. These rolling blackouts are planned, and certain circuits that are critical will always stay online. During the storm, the problem was there was not enough power to allow rolling blackouts, because all of the power had to go into the critical circuits. So all the rolling blackouts, once they started rolling, most of them stayed off, sometimes for 2 or even 3 days. This last responsibility, this last piece is on one level very easy to understand. ERCOT maintains the relationships and facilitates all the transactions between the reps and the people. But there is something that is harder to understand, which is that Texas is a power only, or sometimes called energy only, market. Step back for a second. If you look at all of this stuff that I previously discussed about decoupling these utilities and separating these, this is a common market model. There are about 20 states in the United States that have a very similar model. Most of Europe has this model. The United Kingdom is almost exactly the same model, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and even Japan is awfully similar. It is, so once again, when people say something like it's deregulation's fault that this happened, there are deregulated places all over the world that this doesn't happen. However, Texas does have something that is rarer in the world, and that is this power-only market. What the power-only market means is that in a regulated state, there will be a small amount of reserve capacity that every single generator is required to keep. Basically, think of it as like 10% reserves that you could always produce more than you have. Texas does not have that. In Texas, you get paid for the power you produce. That's it. You don't get paid for saving any on the side. You don't get paid for having extra capacity. You get paid for the power that you put on the grid. The assumption is that because power prices will rise, there will be a compelling economic reason for companies to provide this power. As we will see, that compelling economic reason may not have been strong enough to get these folks to provide the power that the state needed. In a minute, we're going to talk about what happened during the storm. But before we talk about that, I think we have to talk about the benefits that Texas has received from this deregulation. I mean, Texas didn't do this just for fun. Texas did it for a reason. It wanted to continue to grow, and it wanted to grow at a fast pace, both in its business and in its domestic climate. And over this time, Texas has grown. I mean, really substantially. I think I said before, but basically a third of the population is new to Texas in the last 20 years. The demand side in Texas is incredible, and it's growing faster. One of the other tricky things in Texas is that residences are often not required to be winterized. And so their demand is actually higher than in other places as well. So this demand is even more significant in Texas than it might be elsewhere. In addition, Texas's energy production in the petroleum side has really bloomed. Texas is now the largest petroleum producer in the country and one of the most important in the world. And when Texas wants that, right? Texas knows that it needs to produce this power as one of its main economic engines, and it wanted to provide the electricity needed to provide all of those petroleum companies the power they need. So what have been the benefits of this deregulation? I think the first one is pretty obvious. I mentioned that when I started, most of the generation in the state was coal and nuclear. It isn't anymore. Most of the generation in the state is now natural gas and wind. If you're the person who thinks I can draw, that's the easiest thing to draw on the whole board is the wind turbine. Today in Texas, 50% of the power comes from natural gas and between 20 and 30 from wind, with coal and nuclear making up the remainder of it. That is a major success story for Texas. Not only is it making use of Texas's natural resources like natural gas and wind and doing the right thing for the state, but both of these have a lower carbon footprint than coal does. And the nuclear, obviously nuclear has no carbon footprint, but people don't generally want new nuclear plants. There haven't been new nuclear plants in Texas in decades. I want to say one other thing. I left out a fact about this space, the petroleum and commercial space. About 50% of the consumption in Texas, of the demand consumption in Texas, is from this space. Not from residential, not from commercial, it's from this space. And about 25% of that is for petroleum. And so when the storm hits, it actually also stops most of Texas's petroleum processing, which is a problem for the state as well and for the rest of the country. There are other innovations that have happened in Texas besides just the power. Every one of you in Texas now in the last 20 years has a new meter, a new power meter at your house. It's not an old meter. You have a time of use meter that's digital that can be tracked. And that enables all kinds of products in Texas that you could not have had before. So for example, some of these retailers offer time of use programs. You see these on commercials in Texas all the time, right? You get nights and weekends free, or you get to pick a free week. Or, and I would like to spend just a second talking about Gritty, or you get something like Gritty, which launched a really interesting product in Texas. What Gritty is one of these guys. They're an REP, or were, excuse me, they were an REP. And what they did is a unique new relationship for this relationship. For Gritty, what you do is you join a club for $9 a month. And then Gritty provides you with whatever the power price is at that moment is what you pay. That means that for most of the time, people who are at Gritty pay almost nothing for their power. They pay very, very low fees. But in the summer, they can get pretty high bills, $500, $600 for an average house they could get. And in this storm, I'm sure you've all heard, 6,000, 10,000, maybe even a few 20,000. Because of my experience in the industry, I know a lot of people who were on Gritty. There were a lot of people who were willing to take that risk. Many of my friends had multi-$1,000 bills from that company. But that is what Texas wanted. It wanted experimentation. It wanted to try things out. It wanted to see which products would work and which products wouldn't work. And so Texas experimentation in this area has been really effective. All right. So despite all of these benefits, the storm put a significant challenge on the system. Whether you call it Winter Storm Uri or Snowmageddon or the Valentine Storm, it was a horribly impactful storm. ERCOT knew this storm was coming. It wasn't a surprise. And the week before, ERCOT got ready. In Texas, most of these power plants do maintenance during the winter because it has much less demand than in the summer. So ERCOT canceled all of the maintenance. It required all power plants to be back online. It also made a call to the federal EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and asked to be cleared from emission standards for the week so that if power plants had to run at a less efficient standard, they could. That was immediately granted. It also worked with the Railroad Commission of Texas. And if you're a Texan, you may understand this, but if you'll give me just 1 second, I'm going to explain. The Railroad Commission has a weird historical relationship with power production that has never been dealt with. Railroad Commission is actually one of the most powerful institutions in the state of Texas. And they control a really important piece of this that's related to what happens during the crisis. They control this side of the natural gas power plants. They control all the pipelines and distribution of natural gas in the state. So ERCOT asked the Railroad Commission to prioritize all fuel delivery to come to the natural gas power plants, to make that the most important thing so that when the storm hit, they were prepared. Unfortunately, you may remember, there was a storm the week before in Texas. We didn't come into this storm clean. The storm the week before wiped out almost 25% of the generation capacity in the state. So we were already down 25%, most of that natural gas and wind, which had gone down. So we're at 25% down, and the storm hits starting on Sunday night. On Sunday night, Texas hit its peak winter demand ever, 70,000 megawatts, which is a huge, massive demand. But the grid stayed up. Actually, the grid handled it just fine. Even with 25% of the capacity down, nobody noticed a problem. Nobody had problems on Sunday night. It wasn't until Monday night, working our way into Tuesday, that we began to have the real problem. And now I would like you to watch a quick video from my hometown, San Antonio weather station, explaining briefly what happened. Just give me 1 second to get this up. And I apologize if you have to watch a brief YouTube commercial. It seems that sometimes it makes me show them. Guys, can you see the screen? Can somebody just say yes? All right, I see the nods. Let's watch my local weatherman. We will not watch all of this. We'll watch about 3 minutes.
Way down there again, -10, many locations. I'll show you that map here in just a second. Snow, very heavy overnight, starting to let up now. So the heavy inch snows and the big accumulating snows moving out of the way. We have just a few flurries left over, but even those are moving off to the east as the main upper level system kicks through. And back to the west, we've got some sunshine, and we will see some sun as well. Now, this is really interesting satellite imagery. Of course, it's infrared, measures temperature, and this all looks like cloud cover, right? No, notice how it just doesn't move a whole lot? That is snow out to the west of us. And when you look at the visible satellite imagery, you'll just see a blanket of white all over a good part of the state of Texas, which is just truly amazing. All right, so let's take a look at these temperatures. This is amazing as well. 12 degrees, Hondo 11, Seguin 10, New Braunfels at 13 degrees. We've got single digits across most of the hill country. Look at Bernie, 9, Kendall County, Comfort, you're in the single digits. Up around Fredericksburg also, I'm not sure what happened to the thermometer. I guess froze up there at Fredericksburg. Kerrville is 8, Rock Springs 7 is the actual temperature. And we've got 10 degrees at Seguin, and this is really amazing as well. Look at Beeville, down to 17 degrees, down to the coast. Port Aransas is at 20, Victoria at 17 degrees. Just truly amazing. All right, the winds about 15 to 20 miles per hour with gusts up to 30. You can see 20-mile-per-hour wind gust or wind speed right now at George West. Beeville's at 20. We've got 16. So what kind of wind chill does that give us? Feels like -5 out there right now. Feels like -7 Seguin, -8 at Bernie. We've got -11 Rock Springs. I think that takes the cake right now. And so we'll probably drop maybe another degree or two. And so that's why I think those wind chills around -10 or so. So really cold wind chills. Matter of fact, over the last 6 hours, notice how the wind chills have changed. 6 hours ago, we had a wind chill of 2, Brady -15, Dallas-Fort Worth -6. I believe now Dallas-Fort Worth has a wind chill of -14 or so. Lubbock is -15. We've got -10 Georgetown. So just amazing wind chills all across the state of Texas. And look at this cold across the nation. My goodness, 11 degrees Albuquerque, -12. That's a -12 air temperature at Denver.
I think we'll stop when he gets to talking about Denver. Let's see. Guys, can you still see me? Y'all look different now, but you're okay. All right, good. All right. As you can see, if you were looking at my little hometown area down there in South Texas, which does not normally freeze at all. Maybe it'll get to 33 once a year. I don't know if you noticed how many times the weatherman said the word amazing, but it was quite often, or noticed that one of the town's thermometers had frozen. Parts of Texas were 25 degrees below what they normally were. And in places, Texas was the coldest it has ever been in recorded history. There were no records to show how cold this was. I'm saying this because this storm was unique. It is not a normal storm. People throw around words like it's an 80-year storm or a 100-year storm, or who knows. Those all seem a little bit made up to me. You can't really predict how often these things come. Sometimes people compare this storm to the 2011 storm. And those of you who are in Dallas probably lived through that. But this was not at all the same. If you look at the maps of the cold in that 2011 storm, it was bitterly cold in the north part of Texas. But there was a line that basically went like this. And if you were below that line, you weren't freezing. If you were above that line, you were cold for days. So those of us who were in Dallas, we had problems, but the rest of the state didn't. And that enabled the rest of the grid to provide power up here to the north of the state, even though its generators failed in the north of the state. The 2020 storm was not like that. It covered all of the counties of the state. Every single county froze. And it lasted for days. I mean, in Denver, where I live now, this is normal. I mean, we have frozen temperatures here for days, but this is not normal in Texas. It killed most of the crops that had already been planted. We call this part of Texas down here, some people call it the salad bowl. They had already planted their spring crops. They all died. Half of the orange trees in the state of Texas appear to have died. And every lime and lemon tree in the state of Texas has died. And I know you're from the north of Texas, not from down here, but that kind of stuff is incredibly important to the bottom part of Texas. It also killed people. This was largely as a result of the failure of the grid. Because the grid failed and heat went down, people died. About 50, the estimates are still coming in and news reports vary, but about 50 people died of hypothermia and another 50 people died of carbon monoxide poisoning. This was because people brought in charcoal grills or ran their cars to try to maintain heat. Those numbers may go up over time as the analysis comes in, but something like 100 people died. And unfortunately, I think it is reasonable to say that they did die as a direct result of the failure of the electric grid. This was truly a terrible, terrible storm. It's one of the most damaging in history. And I now would like to go through a little bit of exactly what happened on the night of the storm. So just after the end of Valentine's night, early in the morning of the 15th, about 1 a.m., ERCOT issued the first emergency order. And that emergency order said that the utilities had to begin implementing their load shed programs. In just over an hour, generation at plant after generation plant would fail, eventually totaling 340 failed generation plants in Texas. To give you context, 340 failed generation plants is more than half of the generation plants in Texas. They're about 700. This was a system-wide failure. And since I know many of you are systems engineers, when you look at a system problem, sometimes you can find a single unique problem that caused the failure. This was not that. This entire system failed under this storm. The canary in the coal mine was the wind. It froze first. I haven't seen, this is a speculation on my part. I think the reason it froze first is because where it is. It's up here, so it got colder up there first. Before the storm, we'd already lost 15 megawatts of wind. During the storm, we lost another 7. That is essentially all of the wind capacity for the state of Texas froze. Essentially every single windmill was frozen. But if the wind was the canary in the coal mine, it was the natural gas that had the biggest total drop in power. They went from having lost the week before 12,000 megawatts to 15,000 additional megawatts. 37,000 megawatts of generation from those plants went offline. This is where the Railroad Commission comes in again, because they regulate these pieces. All kinds of things failed in this supply chain. The pipes at the plants froze. Upstream pipes froze. Hydrate solids formed in some of the pipes. It was across the board and across the state. But nothing, one other thing about the natural gas is some of these plants, it turned out, were dependent on transportation still. They still had trucks coming in with gasoline, and of course trucks coming in with natural gas. And of course, roads were impassable during this time. So the transportation for those that required it also went down. But none of the generation was spared. The coal literally froze to the ground. So they had lost previously 2 megawatts. They went to a total of 5. And in what seems to me a completely unacceptable thing for the power plants, even one of the nuclear plants went down. Near the nuclear plant that's near Houston went down when the lake froze and it couldn't exhaust its vents. So it eventually lost 2,000 megawatts of nuclear power as well. And then less than an hour into this. So this all of this happened in an hour, which is just absolutely amazing. And less than an hour into it, we had a much more significant problem. Somebody earlier was talking about SCADA systems. One of the advantages of being an IT person is that you get to go into all different kinds of spaces, right? You get to learn all kinds of business stuff by being in the IT space. And I spent a fair amount of time in rooms with what they call SCADA systems, which are the systems that manage the grid. These systems always have 2 big screens in them, monitoring 2 different things. The first one is very obvious. They're matching the daily demand curve for energy with a supply curve that they match very closely. ERCOT is excellent at this. They are very good at matching the supply and demand. The other one is a little harder to understand, and that is that ERCOT has to maintain a frequency on the grid of 60 hertz. If we're in the US or Canada, our grid operates on 60 hertz. ERCOT is extremely good at this as well. They maintain the grid frequency to 3 nines, basically 3 nines reliability. But when supply dramatically outpaces demand, it can shift the frequency. And that's what happened. About an hour into this, the frequency dropped below 60. And when it dropped below 60, it creates a different problem. Because the reason that the grid has to operate at a certain frequency is because the equipment operates at that frequency. And if we start getting off frequency, all kinds of haywire happens with equipment. That would happen at residences. It would cause problems with your microwaves and with your refrigerators, but it has another impact. It actually has an impact with the generation. So If the frequency gets off, it can damage the generation plants. And so the generation plants know this, and they have breakers that are built on the front of the power plants, essentially breakers. You can think of them as breakers. And what happens is if this frequency goes off for too long, most of them are 9 to 10 minutes. If it's off for more than 9 to 10 minutes, the breaker flips and the power plant shuts down. If that had happened across the state of Texas, generation would have stopped, the grid would have collapsed, and we would have gone to a thing called black start to try to restart the grid. That would have been a total and complete failure of the grid and a total and complete failure of ERCOT to manage the grid. This part of the crisis lasted for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. It was off frequency, which gives this number that you've probably heard from ERCOT. They had 4 minutes and 37 seconds left before total grid failure. I just want to pause for a second, because that is, if you're in the industry, that is one of the most frightening things you could possibly hear. There's no modern grid that has had a black start, that has recovered from a black start. People were talking about insane things to restart the Texas grid if this occurred, such as parking nuclear submarines in the Gulf of Mexico to use their power to restart power plants. This would have been a disaster. ERCOT ordered massive shedding of load to get this frequency back in order. But that load shed had really tremendous consequences. I've already said this before, but remember, these organizations, the transmission and distribution companies, have load shed plans in place. And because there was not enough power for even the most critical circuits, right? So we must provide power to Air Force bases and hospitals and other things like that. And there was not enough power to go around after they were provided. So for many parts of the states, blackouts came into place and they did not roll. What we're supposed to do is we're supposed to roll blackouts to spread the pain among the citizens of the state so that you aren't without power for the whole time. But we didn't have enough power to do that. So people were without power for days, millions of people, during the coldest storm that Texas has ever had. And now we will watch one more quick video to talk about the impacts in North Texas.
Driving into the Dorchester neighborhood of Waxahachie, you might as well be in Fargo, North Dakota. Roads and yards still covered in ice and snow. Upwards of 200 homes without power since Sunday. And since Sunday on Benton Creek Court, no answers when this will all end.
This situation, in our opinion, is just unacceptable. And there's no communication, no feedback, and we're just sitting here trying to stay warm.
We are getting no answers, no how, no way. And if it's going to be another week, everybody is going to lose everything they have.
Water is the other lingering and escaping problem. The city of Dallas with 3 times as many calls for service for water main breaks like this one in the Oak Lawn neighborhood. At the Mosaic Apartments in Uptown Dallas, too much frozen water. A broken water pipe in the parking garage and a car now completely encased in ice. In Fort Worth, a large section of West Montgomery Street put under a boil water advisory. At least 212 confirmed water main breaks citywide, with an estimated 200 more to investigate. Some good news from Crum in far north Denton County.
This is going to end up killing my husband.
That phone call yesterday from Shirley Huddleston, her husband on oxygen, needing to stay warm in their car in the driveway. Today, they finally have power.
We have all kinds of power right now. I mean, we're warm. It's just so distraught because I really thought I was going to lose my husband.
We're worried a little bit.
Back in Waxahachie, where they are still waiting for power, there is a prayer post where people can leave messages for the help they need most.
It's mentally and physically exhausting.
Relief from that exhaustion in the form of electricity and heat is all anyone is praying for here now. In Waxahachie, I'm Kevin Reese.
So here we have a temporary set. It's called a conversion denture. These are the teeth in a day that everyone talks about.
I do not know what that was. Pardon me. It just decided to play something else. All right, so we've talked a bit about why the system failed, why the ERCOT grid failed. Let's talk a bit about the impacts of that to Texas. I've already mentioned the loss of human life, but that was not the only consequence of the system failure. About 1 in 6 Texans, or about 4.5 million, were without power for 3 days. The first problem was the heat, obviously. Again, since you guys are mostly from North Texas, you might not know this, but while it is true that about on that blue line, actually, above that line, there's a lot of gas heating across the state, but below that line, it's mostly resistance heating through electricity. And so when the cold comes down here, the demand rises even more than it does at the top of the state. So all across the state, when the demand rose and there was no heat, pipes froze inside of homes, inside of businesses, inside of schools. My high school flooded during this storm. But that was just the beginning of the water problems. Turns out the water production system is connected to the electrical system. I suppose we all know that intellectually, but we hadn't really thought about what would happen during this case. Without power, water utilities were unable to process clean water. So boil notices went out across the state. In San Antonio, where I'm from, the pipes completely froze, no water came. People were seen on the Riverwalk with trash cans getting water from the San Antonio River to take home. Eventually, 12 million Texans would be impacted by these water issues. And the business and economic system has also been impacted. So process manufacturing, which is a continuous manufacturing process, like the people who make these. This was another client of mine in the past. This is a paper tube. A paper tube starts with wood that's then ground up into a pulp and then turned into a slurry and then pressed into paper and wound into this tube. These are not designed, the systems that makes this are not designed to stop. They work all of the time, continuously. And so whenever something like this goes down, it completely, not only does it halt the temporary manufacturing, but it halts the long-term manufacturing as well. This was particularly true here in the petroleum and chemical manufacturing in Texas. It was down for at least a week, plus some additional time for rebuilding the damaged equipment. And that had impacts, economic impacts across the country and down even into Mexico, because Texas provides much of the power, natural gas for Mexico's generation. So they were impacted as well. So here's me, I have been trying to be as factual as possible. Here's me speculating for just a moment. This is a speculation. I haven't seen anyone do the math on this yet, but this storm cost Texas between 100 billion and 200 billion. We know that. And if you look at the benefits that Texas has received over the 20 years that it's been deregulated, I think we would be hard pressed to say that we've had $200 billion worth of benefit. So it is possible that this storm has wiped out the benefits that we have seen so far, the economic benefits that we've seen so far in the state of Texas from deregulation. I would love to see somebody do real math on that, by the way. That is speculation. And now I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about the costs to the industry. Like I said before, the price of power is normally between $20 and $30 a megawatt. Because the price for power during this storm rose to $9,000 a megawatt, and it stayed there for 3 days, there were economic implications across the spectrum. Reps, these guys, spent more money for power for those 3 days than they normally would in 4 years. I'm going to say it again. Reps spent more money for the power for these 3 days than they would normally in 4 years to serve the same customers. And I want to talk about what that means. And Gritty, which we've talked about before, is probably the best example. Gritty is one of these, and it passes on every single cost from here to its customers. That meant customers got $9,000 bills, $10,000 bills. Those customers refused to pay, many of them. Gritty went bankrupt. It is now out of the state of Texas and bankrupt. Just Energy, who I also have worked for, has just filed bankruptcy, but for a completely different reason. Just Energy is also a rep, but it doesn't have one of these schemes where it passes on its power directly to its customers. It buys power and charges its customers a fixed price. But that means Just Energy got stuck with the high bill. And so now Just Energy has had to file for bankruptcy. Brazos Energy, which is not even part of the deregulated market, but does exist inside the ERCOT territory, mostly on kind of along North Texas, right above Dallas and up into the Panhandle. It got a bill from ERCOT for over $1 billion for power during that period of time. It is filed for bankruptcy. CPS, the electric power company that works down here, is suing ERCOT because ERCOT kept the power at $9,000 a megawatt hour to curtail demand even after demand dropped. CPS has a decent chance of winning that lawsuit. And the city of Georgetown, which you guys may not know, but you saw on that map, it's very far South Texas, has just had to issue $48 million in debt to cover its fees during that time. In other words, the economic issue, the impacts to the economic system were substantial. It isn't the case, though, that everybody had negative implications. Some people benefited. Goldman Sachs made $200 million on the trading of natural gas during this period of time. Bank of America had similar gains during this time. The gas suppliers who were functioning, who were able to stay up during this time, like Macquarie, which is an Australian company that operates in Texas, made $200 million. Comstock made a similar amount. Austin Energy, in one of the weirdest situations, despite the fact that it had rolling blackouts mandated by ERCOT, many of its power plants were able to stay up. So the city of Austin Energy has actually made about $50 million during this crisis because its plants stayed up. Didn't benefit its customers at the time. They were still without power. And even more than this, the real problem in Texas now on the economic side is essentially that it's chaos. Nobody knows. Checks are not coming in. People aren't paying each other. There's essentially a chaotic economic situation in the energy market in Texas at this time. All right. I have tried my best to be as factual as possible up until this point. Now I want to talk about what is likely to happen after, which is going to involve some speculation on my part. So I just want to be upfront. This is now Jim speculating. And I want to talk about the political and regulatory system. These systems impact each other. It's obviously the case that the Texas system was designed by Texas's political system, right? It's a reflection of the political system, but systems impact each other. The crash of this ERCOT system is going to impact the regulatory system. The storm has given Texas a pretty big black eye in the industry. You probably know this, but Texas politicians are sort of notorious for insulting other states' energy problems. And they are getting, what would you call that, retribution from other states. Critics both inside and outside are talking about this all of the time. It has had a major impact on deregulation outside the state. There were a few states considering pursuing deregulation. Those are all on hold. Deregulation in the United States is probably on hold for many years. And Texans have lost some faith in their own grid. Forbes just did a study. I'm sure many more of these studies will be done, but it's only been a few months since this happened. Forbes just did a study, and only 20% of the people who were in a deregulated part of Texas felt that they were treated fairly during this process. In other words, Texans feel like other Texans were getting treated better than they were. So what will happen with all of these systems? I want to talk a little bit about demand. So this side. My neighbor in Dallas had a Tesla solar panels and batteries. She never lost power the whole time during the storm. I have a good friend who lives on a ranch. He has a gas generator on his ranch. He never lost power. I think this is going to become very popular. People are either going to go with solar and batteries or some kind of generators. Texans are going to try to isolate themselves from the grid. They're going to try to protect themselves from future failures. And I don't think it'll just be residential people. Commercial people are going to do this as well, and so will the industrial sections. Many Texans are going to take care of this problem on their own. I think this will also be the case over here. These generators lost tons of money by not being able to be productive. Many of these plants will winterize voluntarily. There's an economic incentive to do it. There's an obvious case now where winter weather can hit Texas. I think that will change. Even the wind farms, which are probably the most expensive things to winterize, some of those companies lost millions. And I think one of them said $80 million they lost in those 3 days. I would be surprised if we don't see some of the wind farms voluntarily winterize. Even the gas generators lost hundreds of millions. I can't imagine with a $100 million economic incentive that many of them won't be trying to fix that. And like we said before, I think battery storage is not relevant yet, but it is about to be. And when Texas is thinking about how to solve this problem for the future, I think battery storage is a remarkable potential solution. All right, let's talk about insurance. Texas, this is in the economic system. Texans already pay extraordinarily high insurance costs for homeowners insurance. I'm sure you know that. It's some of the highest in the state, and they're expected to skyrocket after this. For example, in 2020, there were 75 insurance claims for burst pipes in the state of Texas, 75. In 2021, we've already had 30,000. So the cost of insuring Texans will appear much higher to these insurance companies. The lawsuits are flying around Texas. Businesses are waiting for money to come in that isn't coming in. And the lawsuits will probably go on for many years. Many of these businesses we already talked about failed. But their failure will make room for others. My prediction is that for every Griddy that fails, some new company will come in with some new kind of product. That's the advantage of Texas's free open market. All right, those were economic. Let's talk political and legislative impacts. I've heard many people say that Texas could solve this problem easily by connecting to one of the two US grids. That will not happen. I just can't imagine that. It doesn't matter whether you have Republicans in office or Democrats in office. That is not a change that is likely to happen in the state of Texas. That would cause Texas to be subject to all kinds of environmental regulations that it does not wish to be. That will not happen. I also don't think Texas will abandon its power only market. This is the idea that you get paid just for the power that you produce on the market. I don't think that will change. It's too fundamental to the way Texas thinks about producing power. What might change? If you paid any attention to this, you'll see that there's a lot of legislation flying around in the state of Texas. It's currently very much in flux. It's unclear what major changes will happen. In fact, many Texans seem to have taken adopted sort of the mantra that this is a rare event and we don't need to solve for it. I hope that that isn't the case. This rare event was too close to catastrophe to be something that doesn't need to be solved for. But some legislative things have happened. We are going to have a ban on index pricing that, like Griddy. The companies like Griddy are about to be prevented from being in the state of Texas. We've also changed some boards of membership. Somebody was talking about this before and relating it to the pipeline that burst. There's going to be a law in place that will require the members of the boards, various boards like ERCOT, the PUC, to live in the state of Texas and maybe change the size of some of those boards. That's it so far. That's all that's been proposed that's gone anywhere. There has been a Senate bill proposed that would require winterization at plants, and it would fine plants that did not do it. It has not yet passed. It is not clear whether it will. There was another bill to require the winterization upstream of all of the natural gas provision of this. That has essentially failed. It lost to the lobbyists from that industry. Texas has built this incredible market. It has built this incredible capability with all of this creativity. And I believe that Texas does not have to make any of these major changes. Simply one probably change would make a massive effect. The winterization of the plants. The winterization of the plants, if we'd had 75% of the generation capacity of the state winterized, this crisis would have been completely avoided. The combination of that and some winterization of homes would make a major solution, a major difference. I still think in the long run that Texas has the best opportunity for a creative market of any other state. It has the most opportunity, the most competition, and competition and free markets work. They stimulate innovation, they stimulate progress. And I'd like to wrap up this with a little bit of a book. I told you that when I first started working for Texas Utilities, I don't know if I told you this, this was in my bio. When I first started working for Texas Utilities, they sent me to the United Kingdom to study one of their institutions there that they had bought that was in a deregulated market. And I sat down on the plane next to a man I didn't know, and I got out my book to start reading because this was in the days before you had an iPad to take on an airplane. And he interrupted me, and because he'd read that book, and we spent the entire flight talking. An 8-hour flight that I had planned to sleep. We spent the entire time talking. And he asked me when I was flying home, and I told him what day I was flying home. This was pre 9/11, and so he met me at the airport on the way back. It was one of the kindest things that anyone has ever done. Turned out he was a professor at a university there, and he gave me 2 books, and this is one of them. Let's see, get it up close. I don't know if you've ever had a book that you've fallen in love with and read many times, but this book about Karl Popper, who was a philosopher in Europe in the 40s and 50s. And Karl Popper is making an argument for what kind of societies really work, where on earth, what way can we as an earthly society form the best way to produce the best quality of society? And he says the following: living in society are foremost a process of problem solving. And because problem solving calls for the bold propounding of trial solutions, which are then subjected to criticism and error elimination, followed by the genuine possibility of change in light of that criticism, this means that an open society will be more effective at solving its problems and achieving the aims of its members. I still believe that. I've been in this industry now for 20 years. And I still believe that an open, free, competitive, deregulated market will produce the best long-term results, as long as we learn the lessons from the failures that we have along the way. Thank you so much for letting me come talk to you today, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
A lot of great information. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
A lot of great information over there, James. Thank you very much. It was very, very insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're the new person too, aren't you?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, new person.
Hey James, this is Jesse. I'll just say go Tigers.
Oh, hey, that's awesome. Nice to meet you.
Great presentation, Jim. Loved all of the pictures and the story.
I didn't really say we.
Yeah, Jim, this is Kevin Christ. Oh, sorry, here's somebody talking.
I hear you, Kevin.
Oh, okay. So first of all, thank you for doing this. And I want to know when you're going to move back to Texas and run for Congress.
Oh, God. Moving back to Texas could be a possibility. Congress is definitely not.
Oh, please, we need you.
No, I can't imagine. That's not a career for me.
James,
Jim, I have a question.
There were a bunch of questions in the chat, but Kevin, go ahead and ask yours.
I'm sorry, it's maybe a treading on something I shouldn't, but obviously the CEO of ERCOT was dismissed from his position. Yet, well, it sounds like ERCOT, from what I'm interpreting from what you're saying, did the things they needed to do based upon the resources that they had, or in many cases were falling off and didn't have. What's your perspective on that release of the CEO, please?
I think you gave a fair assessment of the facts there. ERCOT is largely reliant on the Public Utility Commission and Texas legislators to set policy, and ERCOT enacts that policy. It seems to me ERCOT enacted the policy it was given, and that ERCOT has been made a scapegoat in this thing. That is an opinion, by the way, but that does seem to me to be the case.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I guess I'll ask the questions from the chat.
Okay.
And we can intersperse live questions if someone asks. One of them is, why did the prices spike so sharply? Was it simply supply and demand? And did it matter what the providers charged? Could they charge as much as they wanted?
It was essentially a supply and demand problem because Texas has this power only market that we discussed before. Power prices fluctuate like crazy during the day, normally within a small window, but they fluctuate like crazy. But when the demand went through the roof, power prices went up to $9,000, and $9,000 is the cap. There is a limit in Texas for how high you can go, and that is $9,000. So it stayed at the cap for 3 days, and a little longer than 3 days. ERCOT actually violated its rules a little bit and kept those prices high for past the time that it should have, and that's why it's being sued by CPS.
I
have a question for you.
Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Bill.
Hey, Jim, I have a question for you. So great presentation. What advice do you have for us in terms of, as an executive or as a citizen of Texas, with the information, how do we go equip change or motivate change?
Oh, wow. I mean, I'll give you a selfish answer first. If I were in Texas, I would do something to give myself a little bit of a balance against the grid. I don't think that's what you meant, but I would seriously consider some kind of solar battery or some kind of temporary generation from gas generation at my home. But I think you were probably asking for a political question, possibly, Bill. Is that you? I think you're asking, what would I do to motivate?
I don't know if it's political as much as just as a business leader, what should we go do to solve it for, I mean, with the economic and other impacts you noted?
I was talking to the CIO of Neiman's recently, or former CIO of Neiman's recently, and during this crisis, they had to do the old school thing where they had their power generators. They were running a truck back and forth to the quick stop to get gasoline for it, and providing their own generation capacity. And I honestly thought that was mostly gone, that world, because we'd all moved our stuff into the clouds and we didn't really have to have our generation capacity on site as much anymore. But it seems to me that business leaders are going to have to think about this grid as a risk until it is solved. So you have to think about the fact that you could lose power for 3 days, and what would that do to your business? And especially if you're in some kind of manufacturing, some kind of process manufacturing, I can't imagine that you're going to be able to ignore this issue going forward. I don't think, but I would like to go back to what Texans could do. I would say, write your congressperson and say that we need to winterize the grid. That's it. We don't have to change the other things. And yes, it will increase the cost of power a little bit, but it will be worth that in the long run.
Thanks.
Hey, Jim, this is Jesse. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I lived in Michigan for 3 years, and they laughed at us when this happened because, I mean, they winterize everything. And so, I mean, that's because they're used to it, right? And I think they were shocked that it was happening to us because it's like, well, wait a minute, didn't you just winterize XYZ? And didn't you winterize XYZ? And I was like, well, no, because down there, they don't think we're going to get that cold. And so it's not worth it. And that's so right. I 100% agree. If, that's why the northern states were basically mocking us this whole time. Yep.
There's been a lot of finger pointing going around for sure.
I guess I'll throw out a couple of the others. It said, I guess this is more of a speculation, and you might have answered it actually. If we had been part of the East and West grid, would we have avoided power loss?
Yes, probably. It's a very hypothetical question, of course, but probably. If you look at actually what happened in Texas, if you were, I probably should have drawn this. Texas and ERCOT are not the same. The space of ERCOT is different than the space of Texas. ERCOT actually looks something like this, with a little bit of a carve out up here and a little bit of a carve out over here. El Paso, which is El Paso over here, is actually closer to Los Angeles than it is to Houston. It's a commonly stated Texas fact. And these guys are actually on the Western grid. Their power stayed on the whole time. So are these. Their power stayed on most of the time. The Eastern grid was a little more complicated. We do have actual real interconnect to the Eastern grid, one. And in emergencies, they can supply us power. But in this case, they were hit by the same storm, and they did not. They gave no power, so those folks lost power as well.
Are there any plans to protect the grid against a sizable EMP like a solar flare?
I don't know in Texas. I actually don't, that's not an area expertise that I really have. I know they think about these questions, but I don't know if there's anything that has been done or can be done to prevent that.
I think that's all of the questions from the chat.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate coming today. Oh, and I have one more tip to give everybody. If you see this thing on my hand, if you've spent a lot of time working on a whiteboard, you know that's really helpful to be up close if you want to be able to draw well. Most people try to draw on a whiteboard out like this. It doesn't work. You have to get in close. And your hand always gets stuck to the board, which is really annoying, especially if you get nervous and sweating. So I found a great use for my old COVID masks. You can easily wind them around your hand and they make a great use. So if you're tired of your COVID masks and you need something else, that's the best tip of the day.
Trinity education at its best right there.
Absolutely.
Trinity education at its best.
Thank you so much for coming. Everyone, remember to sign up for the NTTC conference in late August. And our next meeting, our next general meeting will be in person in September. So look forward to that as well. Thanks all. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, James.
Good night.
Thank you.